So today we're continuing our story about Samson, and we're talking about today a jealous husband, fire foxes, and a donkey-boned victory.
So that's part of it.
Yes.
But the Life Application Study Bible says revenge is an uncontrollable monster, talking about the story we're telling today. It's a boomerang that cannot be thrown without cost to the thrower. So that's what we're talking about on HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
So, Jeff, a few days ago on our podcast,
Yes.
I actually had mentioned that I was going to Las Vegas to see the NFL draft.
That's right.
So I got back from there, and I made a comment that I was excited also to go see a jazz concert with Lady Gaga doing jazz.
Yeah.
Well, many people, by the way, I think it was actually the best concert I've ever seen.
Wow.
Ever.
Wow.
And I've been to plenty of concerts.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. But many people don't know that you play an instrument.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'll brag on you and say you played like first chair, and you are good at this instrument, but I've never seen you play it.
Yeah, I haven't played. So I had a scholarship to college for trumpet.
Yeah.
And so I play most of the brass instruments I can play. And yeah, that was what God used to get me into ministry. So if I hadn't had that in my life, I don't know that I would have ever signed up to be a pastor or preacher, for sure. I hated that idea, but I did have a sense that God was calling me into ministry.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, I'll be a worship guy. And that's how I got in was through music, actually, not having any desire to be a preacher.
Well, considering that I'm a part of planning the weekend services, we're going to have to creatively get you to play the trumpet pretty soon.
Yeah, well, you'll have to give me a few weeks run up because it'll take me a while to get my chops back. But yeah,
All
I
right.
love it. I love brass music. It's a lot of fun. We need more trumpets.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay.
By the way, did you know that I played the trumpet as a kid?
No.
I actually did.
How did I not know that?
Well, because I only lasted for a few years.
Oh, okay.
So the guy I mentioned to you, David Perico, who is a very famous,
trumpet player. Yeah.
trumpet player. I played with him in elementary school.
Wow.
And then I dropped out, and then he continued on, and I thought, wow, he's much better than me. But I dropped out because I didn't really like the trumpet.
Yeah. Wow.
I told my mom, I said, I want to play the drums. And she said, you don't want to play that. It's just banging things. She's like, do the trumpet. It only has 3 keys, three little things. And then I got involved, and I thought, Mom, this is way more complicated than 3 little things.
Yeah. Well, if you'd had talent, you probably still would have stuck with it. Maybe that was it.
It's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
You know what? The Lord opened up some doors. Later on, I had an opportunity to play with some really great groups and did some really big events. And eventually I played with a group here in Detroit that we got to do about 12 concerts with the Detroit Symphony. So it's kind of
awesome.
fun. Yeah, it's kind of maybe the pinnacle. But I didn't play with them. We played as a group with the symphony.
I understand.
Anyways, it's a lot of fun. So, hey, we're talking about Samson today.
Yeah.
And a problem got started in yesterday's episode that now spirals out of control. And it really gets crazy with regard to this revenge cycle that Samson finds himself in.
So Samson got cocky, threw out a riddle for, he was marrying this woman who is actually a part of his enemies, his sworn enemies. He throws out a riddle. And the only reason why they figured it out is because his wife nagged him enough. He told her the secret. She betrayed him. And now he leaves her, and he leaves her at the altar.
Right.
And so he actually sort of abandons the marriage. He's mad at this entire village, and he's mad at her for betraying him.
Right.
So he decides in chapter 15 to get revenge.
And here we go. Chapter 15, verse 1. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. And it says, later on, during the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat as a present to his wife. He said, I'm going into my wife's room to sleep with her, but her father wouldn't let him in. I truly thought you must hate her father explained, so I gave her in marriage to your best man. But look, her younger sister is even more beautiful than she is. Marry her instead. Samson said, this time I cannot be blamed for everything I'm going to do to you Philistines. And then he went out and caught 300 foxes. He tied their tails together in pairs, and he fastened a torch to each pair of tails. And then he lit the torches and let the fox run through the grain fields of the Philistines. He burned all their grain to the ground, including the sheaves and the uncut grain, and he also destroyed their vineyards and olive groves. Who did this? The Philistines demanded. Samson, was the reply, because his father-in-law from Timnah gave Samson's wife to be married to his best man. So the Philistines went and got the woman and her father and burned them to death. Because you did this, Samson vowed, I won't rest until I take my revenge on you. So he attacked the Philistines with great fury and killed many of them, and then he went to live in a cave in the rock of Edom. The Philistines retaliated by setting up a camp in Judah and spreading out near the town of Lehi. The men of Judah asked the Philistines, why are you attacking us? And the Philistines replied, we've come to capture Samson. We've come to pay him back for what he did to us. So 3,000 men of Judah went down to get Samson at the cave of the rock at Edom. They said to him, don't you realize the Philistines rule over us? What are you doing to us? But Samson replied, I only did to them what they did to me. But the men of Judah told him, we have come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. All right, Samson said, but promise that you won't kill me yourselves. We will only tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines, they replied. We won't kill you. So they tied him up with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. As Samson arrived at Lehi, the Philistines came shouting in triumph, but the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson, and he snapped the ropes on his arms as if they were burnt strands of flax, and they fell from his wrists. Then he found the jawbone of a recently killed donkey. He picked it up and killed 1,000 Philistines with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey I've piled them in heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey I've killed 1,000 men. And when he finished his boasting, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was named Jawbone Hill. Samson was now very thirsty, and he cried out to the Lord, you have accomplished this great victory by the strength of your servant, but now I must die of thirst and fall into the hands of these pagans? So God caused water to gush out of a hollow in the ground at Lehi, and Samson was revived as he drank. Then he named the place the Spring of the One Who Cried Out, and it is still in Lehi to this day. And Samson judged Israel for 20 years during the period when the Philistines dominated the land.
So, I mean, this sort of begins the very first glimpse into the strength and the almost the magic that God has gifted. The power that God has gifted Samson with. Yeah. And so it's a back and forth, is what we see.
Right.
So he goes in, and we don't really know if he's really repentant. You know, like, hey, it's over. I'm going to go ahead and be with my wife now. Right. You know, we don't know if that was sincere, but...
well, he brought her a baby goat. How more sincere can you be than that?
That's true. And then she says, well, I thought you hated her. I gave her over to the best man, who really wasn't his best man. It was just another Philistine, right? Because Samson didn't have any friends.
Right.
So anyway, so then he gets mad, and he says, okay, you brought this upon yourselves. I can't even imagine tying 2 foxes' tails together and then putting a lit torch and then having them run through. First of all, I love animals. I'm thinking like poor foxes.
Right. Well, this is pretty heartless.
Yes.
It is to the animals. It's horrible. It really shows kind of maybe a hint as to what's going on in his heart.
Yeah. And
he did it to 300 of them.
Yeah. And let's not forget all of the wheat and the food and the olive groves and the vineyards that he destroyed and burned down. And then
in the sheaves, that's how they would have stored it.
Yeah.
So everything that was growing, everything that was in the ground, and all of the stuff that they had stored, he burned it all. And in an agrarian society like that, that's all they had to eat.
Right.
He put them in a famine that fast.
So then they go back and kill. They kill the wife, the woman who caused
and her father
commotion, and their father.
Yeah.
So now the woman who he said that he wanted to marry me.
Right.
Then he goes back and he finds the jawbone of a donkey, and he slays 1,000 men, and then he brags about it, and he writes his own song.
Right.
And he says, look at me.
Yeah.
Look at me. I've done this. I mean, it's just back and forth. And I mean, it's just incredible.
Well, one thing, what you're going to find through this whole book, or through this whole section of the book of Judges, is Samson is the most narcissistic hero in the Bible. He's so self-centered, right? So he gets hurt. He leaves his wife at the altar. When they're ready to get back together, he's angry, and he abandoned his wife. As a matter of fact, there's a hint here. It says later on, during the wheat harvest. So when he left her, it wasn't during the wheat harvest. Now it is. They were separated for months. And suddenly he decides, I'm going back to get her. Right? She's mine. I'm going to go in the house. I'm going to sleep with her. That's what he announces. Here's a goat. Right?
Here's a goat.
and her father's like, what do you mean? So everybody felt like he abandoned his wife. That's what they all thought. I think it's fairly innocent from the father's perspective, right? Your daughter's of marrying age. It's time. She wants to be married. This young man in the village is fine. He was at the wedding, so you can marry her instead. And then Samson shows up, and somehow they did the wrong thing. He abandoned his wife, but they did the wrong thing.
Yeah, I mean, you're ultimately correct, but because nothing justifies, abandoning your wife at the altar. However, we can't underestimate or overlook the cruelty that Samson, they brought upon Samson.
Sure.
Right? So they're the ones that coerced his wife to get her to tell the secret.
Right. He felt betrayed by her. Sure.
Well, he felt betrayed by her representing the entire family.
Right.
So we have all this family, every single person, was behind sort of the idea of coercing her.
Sure.
So that, in other words, it was him against all of them.
Yeah. So the punishment to them was, you're not coming home with me.
Right.
Right. Then he decides months later,
right,
to come back and demand his right as a husband.
Right.
At that time, finds out, well, you abandoned her. We gave her to somebody else, and now somehow they deserve punishment because he'd abandoned his wife. Right. So I feel like the first round was he went and killed 30 Philistines. There's no consequence for that, and now it was a couple towns over. It was Ashkelon, but still, he kills 30 Philistines. There's no consequence for that, and he leaves his wife. So those are the consequences. If it had just stopped there, it would have been fine. But now he's mad because his wife has been given to another man. So now he burns down all their stuff. So here's a second round of consequences. You gave my wife away, so now I'm going to burn down all of your stuff and put your families for all of the villages around at risk. Right? I burned down all of your food. And if you don't can enough in the spring and summer, you don't have enough for the winter, right? That's really how it went for them.
So let's talk about this idea of killing 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey.
Oh, my goodness.
So that means that he, by the way, let's not overlook the fact that that's part of a carcass.
It's a dead animal. That's right.
Dead animal.
Yeah.
So we don't know if it was, how deteriorating it was, how decomposed it was, whether it was just the...
Yeah. But it does show how flippant he had an attitude towards the call and the demands of God on his life.
Right.
Yeah.
So he picks up this jawbone of a donkey, and so I'm sure it was a strong, weapon, obviously, right? It probably had, ridges with teeth in it and things like that. But to kill 1,000 men, which means by the time you get to like the 500th man, I'm pretty sure they've probably armed themselves with spears and shields.
Oh, yeah.
At that point, right?
Right.
And so how could you possibly
You ever watch
that?
a kung fu movie? You ever watch a kung fu movie and he fights one guy? He's surrounded by 15 guys,
right?
But he fights one at a time.
Yes.
Is that what's happening here? How do you have 1,000 guys come up and you're not getting attacked? Why don't they just attack you from behind or whatever? I don't know. It must be like a kung fu movie.
Yeah, or maybe he was impenetrable. Maybe he just, maybe he was that quick.
Yeah.
Because I'd like to think, in my mind, always goes toward the visual, right?
Yeah.
Always. I see this as like the most dramatic fight scene in the history of fight scenes. Yeah. And so, he takes out 1,000 people. And then had it gone there and had it ended there, you'd have been like, wow, that was part of sort of the mission. But then what does he do is he demonstrates this bragging on himself.
Ugh.
In every other place in the Bible, like when King David slayed the Philistines, right? Which is sort of the same problem that generations later, other people sang about King David.
Yeah, they sang about him.
Right.
But he's like, let me just wax eloquent and sing a soliloquy about myself.
Which, by the way, it's like giving yourself a nickname like George Costanza in Seinfeld.
Yes, yeah, that's
Remember when he tried to call himself T-Bone? Yes. And he's like, he's in the conference room and he's like, I'm going to order a T-bone steak.
That's right.
And then they ended up calling him Coco the Monkey.
That's right.
Because he got mad at the guy who got the nickname T-Bone.
That's right.
And so he was yelling with a banana and they said Coco the Monkey. Anyway, that's what it seems like. You can't give yourself a nickname, and you can't certainly write songs about yourself, right? Yeah. And it's just another thing where we see Samson doing this dual kind of a thing where he's fulfilling the mission by destroying his enemies, and at the same time serving himself to the highest degree.
Yeah, and so God had to find ways for him to fulfill his mission, even though he wasn't always focused on God. Even in this situation, Samson is of marrying age. He's an adult man. This isn't some guy who's, 15 years old. Here's an adult man, probably 30, and he still hasn't gone up against his enemies. And so God, even though Samson is behaving poorly, God used these circumstances around his marriage and around the death of his wife to finally motivate him to begin fighting against the Philistines. That was always his mission. And God will always override you to get his will done if that's what he has to do. Because if Samson had his way, his marriage would have crippled his ability to fulfill his mission. And so God was like, okay, it's not going to work out well. And by the way, all the Philistines have to die. So this is what's going to happen.
Yeah. It's that's an important part of the story. A lot of people seem to think that no matter what happens, God orchestrates it. Like God must have done this. And I oftentimes believe that sometimes, like especially when tragedy comes our way, we think, well, God did this. And it's like, no. Let's be really careful what to lay at the feet of God. But to your point, God is always going to use things.
Use it. That's right.
And so he'll take something bad and God will do what he almost always does.
Yeah.
He'll bring good from the bad. He'll bring
Even
beauty
though
from the
Samson's
ashes.
motivation wasn't great.
No.
Samson's motivation was, I only did what they did to me.
Right.
That was his defense.
Right.
How juvenile is that? But that's what got him riled up. He got riled up to where he's finally squaring off with the Philistines. And what you would think is now it's going to be full-on warfare from here on out with Samson. Of course, it's not, we know. But that's what you think is coming. And then he gets up, he sings a song, I did this, look how great I am. And then when he's all done, he's like, whew, that was tough. Man, God, you're so lucky I'm helping you out. You can just imagine. And he goes, I'm so thirsty. What are you going to do? Now, after all I've done for you, you're going to let me die of thirst? He's just a whiner, man. This guy is so self-centered. And, do you ever see some of the, you reference the particularly handsome or the particularly strong or whatever. Sometimes, I think of them sometimes as peacocks, just a little bit, always preening, always. They look the part, but they don't have any real inner strength, right? And so he has all the talent. He looks the part. He has all the advantage. He's funny. He tells riddles. He can deliver on every promise. He can do all these things. But then he's like, oh, I'm so thirsty. God, why are you going to let me die? Right? And he just seems really weak on the inside.
Yeah. Right? And we have to take note of the fact that God was faithful and God decided to, do a miracle, literally.
Yeah.
So God brought water up from the ground to, give Samson strength, meaning like, hey, I'm still with you. And all your imperfections, you're still accomplishing my will, and I'm going to help you along the way, and I'm going to provide for you. I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to be with you. And so he receives a miracle from God by getting water.
Somehow he thinks that God owes him. And how often do we get to that point where we think God owes us because we worked extra hard for him or we did something, and God chose to bless him in spite of himself, right? He didn't deserve God's blessings, but God said, you know what? I'm going to bless you in spite of yourself. How often does God do that and we still don't see it?
Yeah. And I love the fact that God still accomplishes his will, which is, again, eliminating the enemy, the evil in the world through the Philistines, even through somebody who's completely imperfect. So, a lot of times we feel like, okay, we're going to try to do our best and we're going to try to put God first in everything we say and do. And a lot of times we don't fulfill that. We get sort of caught up in our own selfishness. We try to serve God with our business, but then there's a part of it that, I'm trying mostly, but I got to be selfish in these 7 ways,
Right.
Or maybe in our marriages or in our relationships or in our friendships or maybe with our time and our resources. We have good intentions. We try our very best, but our flaws are so, on the surface. They're so apparent,
right.
and we blow it. We disappoint people. And but let's not underestimate the fact that God can and still will accomplish great things through us. And it won't be perfect.
Right.
And it won't be, perhaps to our fullest potential. But in this case, God is still going to use Samson and do good through his life.
Yeah. I understand for somebody who's super talented and so gifted, he'd lived his entire life probably always being stronger than everybody else. I bet you he was a freshman in high school. He was a starter on the football team. You know what I mean? He was just better at everything than everybody else. So sometimes you just don't realize that these gifts didn't come from you, especially being immature. So he helps God out. He does this great victory. He demands a drink. And God does it. So he could take credit. In his mind, he's taking credit. I killed 1,000 guys with the jawbone of a donkey. I began this war against these Philistines, all this stuff. Look what I've done for you, God. But then God does a miracle that he has nothing to do with. Gives him water. And what does he do? He names the well the spring of the one who cried out.
Wow. Dude, I missed that.
He names it after himself, right? He doesn't say, wow, God provides when I'm thirsty. Nothing about God. It's, I prayed and got it.
Wow.
Right?
I never even noticed that.
This is what I'm saying is he's so flawed internally.
Yeah.
It's his narcissism is eating him alive. And I'm just saying, all you have to do is do a casual scroll through social media, and you can see all the narcissists that are wondering why their life is so hard.
Yeah.
Right? And he's taking credit even for the miracle he can't take credit for.
Right. It's the thing he had nothing to do with.
Right. And, I prayed for this and got it. That's what we're going to call it forever.
Oh, it's about me.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to talk about me. You want to talk about...
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So as we move into our final thoughts, the final thought for today would be what? A good beginning doesn't guarantee a good ending.
Yeah.
So Samson was called to defeat the Philistines, and somewhere along the way, he sort of gets...
Well, his promise was incredible.
Yes.
And I think on one side, wow, at his best, it's the best ever.
Right.
At his worst, it's the worst ever. I mean, he's the best and the worst. And so there's this tremendous conflict. And I don't know that there's anything sadder than unfulfilled potential. Mm. Because when he started off in the one yesterday, he had all this promise. And today, he's not using it for God. He's using it for himself.
Yeah. All right. Well, join us tomorrow as we continue on the life of Samson the judge.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.